In this video we're going to be talking about inserting cells, columns and rows. But before we get stuck into the detail, things are going to start to get a little bit more complicated from this video onwards. So the best thing to do is download and open the course materials that are found within the Learning Fever website. And make sure you follow along to make sure you can replicate any steps that I do in the video. Okay, so let's start off with inserting rows. What is inserting rows? Well, inserting rows is something that we haven't come across before, and it is a little bit different to some of the other functionality we've looked at in terms of copying and pasting. With inserting row, you're not moving data around a sheet in the conventional sense, you're changing the structure of the worksheet. So let's just do a demonstration. I'm going to choose to insert a row between row 7 and row 8. To do that, I'm actually going to pick the lower of the two rows. I'm going to right click on the row header, and then I'm going to click Insert. Now you'll see that a new row has been created between 7 and where 8 used to be. 8 has now become a blank row, and what used to be row 8 is now row 9. You'll see from my indicator column here, these were the original rows, and where row 8 used to be is now in fact row 9. So what has happened here effectively is that Excel has created a new row, pushing the data that was below the row downwards and leaving the data above it in place. And in fact, if we could think about it that way, the last row of the sheet at row 1 million has been knocked off and deleted from the sheet, and a new row created at row 8. In this way, it is very different from clearing data. Clearing data doesn't change the row or column positions. It simply deletes the contents of the cells and leaves the cells exactly as they are. We can do the same with inserting columns. I can click between B and C, and I'll click on the rightmost of the two columns, highlight that column, right click and insert. A new column has been created between B and where C used to be. As you can see, column C has now become D to make way for the new C column. So let's go a little bit further in understanding inserting columns and inserting rows. I'm just going to undo those actions as we looked at in the previous section. So far we've just looked at inserting single rows, but we can also insert multiple rows at the same time. So for example, instead of selecting just row 8 to insert a row above row 8, I can select, let's say, 3 whole rows or 4 whole rows beneath 7. Now when I right click and find the insert function, I'm going to insert 4 rows to replace the 4 rows that I have selected. So those 4 rows have now been created, pushing down the existing 4 rows. As we can see from the original row numbers, row 8, 9, 10 and 11 have been pushed down, making way for the new row 8, 9, 10 and 11 that have been created. Similarly, if I want to add in multiple columns at a time, I can select a block of 4 columns, for example, and when I click Insert, it will insert 4 columns in place of those columns. Let's undo those 2 actions. So we've looked at inserting rows and inserting columns. Next up, we're going to look at inserting cells. But I've left inserting cells till last because inserting cells is actually much more complicated than inserting columns. Or it's easy, but the results have to be understood very carefully. So let's say, for example, I want to add some more data to this sheet. I might think that the thing I need to do is insert cells. And I might decide that I'm happy with this information here, so I just want to insert some new information to these cells. For the purpose of this experiment, I'm going to color my whole sheet. The reason for me doing this is just so we can see where the data is moving. And you'll notice that I've got a clean line at the bottom of these rows. So let's select these cells here, and let's say I want to insert some new cells. As we did before, I'm going to right click and go to Insert. We get a pop-up menu asking us how we want to insert these cells. Well, let's stick with the default in this situation. Normally the default selected by Excel will be the most logical option. Here it is to shift cells down. That's probably what we want to do if we want to add more data to a list, is push the rows down so we can add more list items. So let's try shift cells down. Now, when I've inserted the cells, deceptively, Excel has filled the color formatting in. But if this was a true, unadulterated, unhelped insert, the color of these cells should actually be white in some regards. That's the sort of output that I would be expecting at this situation. So what has happened to our text? Well, where these new cells have been created, the old cells have been pushed down. I've inserted one row, so they've been pushed down one row. Now, even at this point, although my colors look a bit strange, it doesn't look like a total disaster. But if I was to come down to the bottom of the list, I might see that some of my items have actually been pushed out of the list. And this is because the row referencing has been distorted. We've moved things that used to be in line with each other. For example, this row used to read Jones East Pen 199.64 127, but now the information has been pushed down, so we've now got a mix of data from Jones East and now with Binder and 499. This is effectively a distortion of our data. This kind of distortion is very, very dangerous, because if I hadn't applied this grey formatting to the sheet, we potentially might not even have noticed that this distortion has happened. As a point of best practice, I would recommend never inserting cells if it can be avoided. There's other ways we can get round our needing to insert. If I wanted to insert more information into this list, the best way to do it would be using insert row. Why is this better? Because at least when we insert row, we keep all row information at the same level. We don't end up with a stepped problem whereby some of the information is on one row and the rest of the information is moved to another row. All information consistently would have moved down. We can have a similar effect if we try and insert cells in a column-wise fashion. Let's first of all undo my changes. So let's try and insert a block of cells in a column sense. Again, I can go to Insert, and here is going to tell me to shift cells right. Again, because I'm inserting a column, shifting the cells right, i.e. taking these cells and pushing them further right, is probably the most logical situation. But we could choose one of the different options, such as shifting the cells down. This would have the effect of taking this range and pushing it further down, or pushing the column of information out at the bottom of the list. We can also shift the entire row or entire column. Let's just try shift cells right. Now again, if it wasn't for the formatting being applied automatically, we would probably expect this cell to be white or to have no fill, because they are effectively new cells. We can see that the information has now been moved across. And also we can see this is potentially even more dangerous than the problem we had before. Now the column that used to contain only numbers has a mixture of numbers and text. These units here, which was a count of how many units, are mixed with the price of the units. And we also have some data that has just been completely dislodged off the sheet. As you can tell, this is not a great situation. Again, this is why I recommend not inserting cells if you can avoid it. Instead, try inserting columns or inserting rows. Let's have a quick look at an example. First, I'm doing my changes. Let's say there's a new bit of information I want to add to my list, a new column or a new field in this case. I can simply insert column, create a new field name, and I can start to add data into that column. As we can see, the rest of the structure has been maintained. I still have my rows in uniform situation, no new rows have been dislodged or anything, and I can see that there's no data poking out the side of my list either. So we've successfully added a column, added new information to the row without distorting any of the workbook. This has been quite a long video, but it is worth understanding very carefully what the effects are on your workbook when you insert rows, columns, and cells.